Thanks, fellas. Nigel nicked most of what I was going to say this morning. I was sitting at the front, gaily scratching out paragraphs of stuff, right? I'll talk briefly about the European Anglers Alliance and what's happening in Europe. And then if we've got time, then we can look at the Angling Trust, yeah? But I think the work we're doing in Europe is the most important work that's going on with sea fisheries, because the reality is all the decisions are made in Brussels. I don't know how much you know about structures for common fisheries policy, but it used to be that the Council, which is the Council of Ministers, and the Commission had joint responsibility for the common fisheries policy. With the new policy, the Parliament has equal rights in determining policy. But this is a whole new thing, because you used to have two lots head to head about what they wanted, which is a relatively easy way to sort of fight out, because somebody throws a punch and somebody loses. Now we've got three people in the ring, and the first thing that happened was Parliament voted to include recreational sea fishing in the common fisheries policy. But the Council of Ministers, they're the ministers working for the national fishery departments, and the Commission, neither of them wanted us included. And I know a lot of anglers think we shouldn't be included, but if you understand what the common fisheries policy is about, if we're not included as equal stakeholders in those stocks will never be managed to our benefit. They will always be managed for the commercials, and commercial fishing historically has fished down the food chain. You know, when the food industry is trying to find ways to turn jellyfish into food that's palatable to human beings, that tells you how bad the sea stocks are, yeah? Because there's more jellyfish out there than there are fish. And that means the industry has to find a way of processing that animal to produce it, to put it on a plate for us, because there's not sufficient fish out there long term for them to keep putting fish on our plates. So if anglers and recreational fishers don't have a voice in the common fisheries policy, effectively we don't have a voice in Brussels over anything that affects what we do as our pastime or our sport or whatever you want to call it when we go fishing. Yeah? And I know that's a difficult thing to grasp, but personally, I'm a great believer you should be sitting at the table, banging it loud and kicking feet under it to make sure people are hearing our voice. Not everybody agrees with my style when it comes to politicians, but you know, there you go. Anyway, we got excluded. We've only got one mention in the common fisheries policy, and that's Regulation 55, as was. They want to know what we take. So this is a negative view of recreational sea angling. What you also need to understand on common fisheries policy is that recreational fishing in the rest of Europe is much, much broader than going out with a rod and line. I was at a conference in France at Saint-Nazaire last November where we were trying to negotiate with the French sea anglers a position for bass that we could all go to Brussels with. The interesting thing about that conference was it was a large theatre with about 370 people attending, men and women of all ages and all social structures, and it included rod and line fishermen, sailors, free divers, you know, fellas who dive with no air or no snorkel. I mean, serious, you know, hunks, six-packs that came up to here, and the people that collect food off the beach. And French law is different to ours. In France, you may do what the law says you may do, and you know the bit of law that tells you that you can do what you're doing. Whereas in Britain, you may do whatever you like as long as the law says you may not. So here we have a law that says you may not do things, and in France they have a law that says you may. So in France there are 890,000 people registered collectors of food from beaches. And because they're registered, they put an annual return in. The government knows precisely what they're taking off the beaches in terms of scallops and bits and pieces like that. The divers are not allowed to carry a spear or a spear gun if they're using any diving aid at all. So they know that if a guy's carrying a spear, he must be a free diver and he can't be wearing anything. So that's very easily regulated. The sailors regularly put a couple of lines out behind their boats as they're sailing along in the hope of catching their supper for the night. So they're registered as recreational fishers. And they've also got loads and loads of people to go out with nets and do a bit of netting here and there, but they're all registered as well. Whereas in this country, unless you're selling your catch, then you don't need to be registered. And actually, under the buyer and sellers regulations, which is what makes the Sea Angling 2012 reports of our catches against the commercial catches fatuous, is a commercial fisherman in one sale to a purchaser of fish can sell 30 kilos of fish and he doesn't have to register the sale or register the landings. Well, we know that a lot of bass are taken by inshore fishermen, and yet a lot of those bass are sold in smaller than 30 kilo lots to people who are buying fish commercially, but they're not, those fish are not registered anywhere in the system. So we've got huge amounts of fish that are being landed and we don't know how much is being landed. We know what's being landed off the big vessels because they've all got transducers on and they got logbooks and they have to fill in their catch returns, but the small vessels don't. So one of the things we need to get established is we need to get hold of this buyers and sellers regulation and get some sense in it. And I know that DEFRA are really quite opposed to buyers and sellers regulation because they see it as a weakness in their data collection. There are people in Europe, countries in Europe, who think it's a good thing to have all these loopholes, and you'll know most of those countries. If you draw a line across Europe, basically through the English Channel, we've got the Northern Europeans, us, the Dutch, the Germans, the Scandinavians and the Poles, who principally have a common interest in how we manage our fish stocks and keeping sizable fish on people's plates. But you've only got to walk through a fish market in France or Spain or Italy or Greece or Portugal to see little fish of that size being sold for the plate, and they're considered a great delicacy. Well, they're that size because there's nothing much bigger than that in their seas. They fished them out. And there's this common fisheries policy that we all talk about actually is, it would be fair to call it the uncommon fisheries policy, because we've got three distinct fisheries in Europe. We've got the Mediterranean fishery, which has already got its own subsection of rules. We've got the Baltic fishery, where most of the fish caught you can't sell, and if you do sell them, you're not allowed to export them because they've got so much deadly poisons in them, because the Baltic Sea is a closed sea and gets all this industrial waste falling into it. And then we've got the North Sea and the North East Atlantic fisheries, which is the fishery that principally interests us. Now, when EAA came to establish a bass position paper, we were attempting to establish a policy that suited all of Europe. And when I took over as chair of the sea angling subgroup, I said, look, this is madness. If we're going to have a policy, we need a North East Atlantic policy on bass, because that's the stock that most interests rod and line fishermen, which is the fishermen the European Anglers Alliance represents. And it's for other people to represent their interests on those stock. We can't get involved in the Baltic fishery, it's all too complicated, and we can't really get involved in the Mediterranean fishery because we've only got one member around the Mediterranean coasts in EAA. Most of the anglers south of the Channel are represented in SIPs and FIPs, which is principally competition anglers, and most of the anglers north of the Channel are represented in the European Anglers Alliance, which is about conservation and sport fishing. So there's even a split in angling in that sense. And we looked at what we wanted out of the bass management, and there are two issues in bass management. Necessarily, because of the stock collapse, there's short-term measures that need to be taken like now. And then there's a position, what I call the long position, which is where we want to get to in terms of managing bass. So we drafted a paper, which Nigel was quite right, it was about as soft as it could be, because you're trying to negotiate everybody into the same position, and we were conscious of the problem that if we got it wrong, it would put pressure on the Irish government, and Irish sea anglers would lose their access to the stocks they've got now, along with all the visiting British anglers that go to Ireland to fish for bass. So we were trying to find a position where we could get to where we wanted to go and get a solution that wouldn't upset, or we keep the French on board with us, because the French sea anglers are very supportive, but their government isn't, not upset our colleagues in Ireland, and would satisfy the needs for managing the stock. I have to say the first draft didn't do it, and we kicked it around and kicked it around, and in the end we went back to the DEFRA submission to Brussels for the short-term management plan in terms of limitation of effort, closing the pair trawling in the southwestern approaches, which is doing, we believe, the most significant damage to stocks, and bolstering the DEFRA position, because we felt that if EAA was seen to support one of the member state positions in the short-term management plan, that was more achievable than anglers standing up and demanding more than any member state was demanding. Not the ideal solution, but short-term we've got to try and protect those stocks, and we can't have the French determining that it becomes a tax stock, because the minute it becomes a total allowable catch stock, there will be quotas, and there'll be a huge battle between the big vessels and the small vessels about who gets that quota, bearing in mind most of the quota would go to France. I think 84% of the quota would go to France. So that won't change the fishing in the southwestern approaches one bit. Those stocks will still be depleted. And we need to get to a position where we stop the total allowable catch process, but bolster the position of all the other member states who don't support attack and want technical measures applied. It was interesting at the French conference that along with the 380 odd anglers and divers and sailors in this conference, we had 3 officials from the French Fisheries Department included, and the minister came down for the opening session. So there was a big government presence there, and her view of the negotiations over bass was that the rest of Europe was out of step with France, which is an interesting perspective on the world, to say the least. Our concern is that the French, if they dig their heels in, will stop anything happening, because if they can't, for them politically, getting a quota is really important, because it will guarantee their fish as a share of what's available forever, effectively. So they're simply playing politics with this. They're not that concerned about fish stocks. I think the rest of the member states are much more concerned about the fish stock and trying to make the fisheries policy work the way it's intended to work in terms of preserving those fish stocks going forward. So short term we're looking for a 42 centimetre landing size. Longer term we're looking to go to 48, and recently we've been discussing moving on to 54. But that's about staging, and also there's an issue particularly in some parts of Britain where lots of people don't see any bass over 40 centimetres even now, because we are right on the edge of their range. Their range, I think, is going to be moving north, because we're seeing lots of other species moving into the southern waters, which would tend to indicate waters are warming significantly. We should expect bass to extend. We're hearing that there's good bass fishing now off parts of Scotland, and they're beginning to see significant numbers of bass in Scandinavia. So they're certainly spreading north, but it tends to be smaller fish right on the edge of that stock. And you've got to find a level at which you can satisfy the needs of the angling community across Europe. And this is always a problem in Europe. It's always negotiation. You can't just go and say, well, this is what we want, end of. You have to negotiate your positions. And I think most people realise that when you negotiate something, you never end up with 100% of what you want. And you come away pretty dissatisfied most of the time. But my view of it is if you can take a couple of steps forward and you can carry everybody with you, that's better than taking 15 steps forward and being out on your own surrounded by the enemy. Because you need your allies to win these battles. Whether that's going to be successful, I honestly don't know, but we'll keep plugging away. Nigel, we've spoken a lot today about support and numbers, and I'd sort of like to give you some idea of numbers. David Mitchell from the Angling Trust, who's our lead on sea fisheries matters, is doing a lot of work in Europe, as is Mark Owen, our lead on freshwater. Our lead on freshwater is funded principally out of Environment Agency funds, which we take in for delivering things for the Environment Agency. They both spend a lot of time in Europe, and Mark Owen's time in Europe is paid for by rod licenses, or rod licence funds effectively. David's time in Europe, which is just as costly, is paid for by Angling Trust members, because there's no sudden income stream for sea angling. And I know it's a sensitive issue, but it's one we need to consider. We need to consider the issue of a licence. And I say that for two reasons. Number one, all of this work that's done, inevitably in Europe, ends up in Brussels. And even if you're only in Brussels for a night and a day for a meeting, by the time you've taken the train or the plane, got a hotel in Brussels, which is a joke, and had dinner, you don't need to go out and eat expensively in Brussels to eat really expensively. You're on the thick end of at least 750 quid for a one-day visit to Brussels to do some fisheries work. 750 quid is 30 members. I think that's right, if my maths is right. 25 quid into 75, you work it out. It's a lot of money that we have to find to send David to Brussels probably once or twice a month on different fisheries issues. And that's the same for all the member states in Europe, some of whom are much smaller than us in terms of their numbers. But we need anglers' numbers, and we need anglers' money, because actually there isn't any funding for sea fishes work, and that's a big issue. Somebody asked earlier today why the Americans were so successful in terms of managing their striped bass. Well, the striped bass fishery now is a licensed fishery. It raises huge amounts of revenue off that fishery from recreationals every year, and those recreationals are funding the people who are monitoring the fishery and managing fish stocks for the future. So without some form of licensing, and I think that's actually it's probably quite inevitable, because government is thinking that way, without some form of licensing and regulation, we're not going to be in the game long term as anglers. And we do need to think about that. And I get all of this stuff about, we've got the right to go and take the fish out, but the world, as the stock is depleted in the sea, the administrators are looking to manage that stock more and more precisely. And I think it's inevitable that sooner or later there will be an administrator somewhere in Europe who says all sea anglers must be registered. And that'll be the first thing, it'll be registration. And then down the line, registration will become a licence. And then the licence will become bag limits. And all of those issues will become probably real live issues in the next 20 years. Because I sense this sea of change going through the administrations about how they can manage stocks. You've got to remember that the commercials have an organisation called Seafish representing them at every level. Seafish is not paid for by the commercials. It's paid for by a 2% levy on every fish product imported or sold in the United Kingdom, and it's paid for by you guys. Every time you buy fish, every time your wife buys fish, you put a few pennies into the coffers of Seafish. And we've got one full-time lobbyist in Brussels, employed by the whole of the European fishing community, and we've got David and other national people going into Brussels occasionally and lobbying. Seafish are funding 20 or 30 professional lobbyists in Brussels every day of the week, and a similar number of lobbyists working around the member states as well. So the tax you pay on food is paying for people to destroy the stocks that you want to go and catch at weekends. That's a question you can ask your MPs. We can't get anything dedicated to sea angling, but an industry can wrap itself up in this little cloak of taxpayers' money and fund and justify itself. Bearing in mind, this is an industry that only employs in England 4,800 full-time fishermen. Yeah. 92% of all the fish they process is imported into this country. It's not even caught in this country. So this is an industry we're paying taxes on to support importers to sell us food that are probably grown in fish farms that are unsustainable and taking fish stocks out of the sea to feed the bloody things they're growing in the fish farms. Yeah. It's a beautiful, you couldn't create a Machiavellian loop like this. If you sat down with a book, you couldn't make it as bad as it is. And that's why BASS as an organisation is so important, and it's why the representative bodies are so important. It's why it needs, you know, all 80 or 90 of you guys here today to get involved and fight the battle on a weekly, daily, monthly basis. Somebody here said something about too little, too late. I was at a CFAS conference last week on aquatic animal health issues in freshwater, and I was talking about the 5 topics that most concern recreational fishers when it comes to fish health. And my last item on the list was too little, too late, too often. And there's a disease of carp called Coiherpes virus, which was first discovered in Derby in 1996. First notified, the first recognised outbreak was in Israel in 1998. It appeared in this country a year later again, and was actually recognised for what it was. And this year, in February, DEFRA introduced some regulations to finally control the importation of fish that come from countries that have active Coiherpes virus in them. And my argument was, too little, too late, and it happens too often. And this is a common theme. It's very easy for DEFRA to bury their heads in the sand and hear what, or listen to what we're saying, but not react to it. Because politicians are only there for 4 or 5 years. The last fisheries minister we had, Benyon, actually did know a little bit about fish. I know he couldn't recognise sea fish in the market, but he was at least a fisherman. The reality is, the only bloke we've ever dealt with, and I've been doing this nearly 30 years now, the only bloke we ever dealt with who was decent and upright and honest and said it the way he saw it was Ben Bradshaw. But for me, he was the dogs, because he said it at the front end, I can do this and I can do that and I can do that. And he was serious about changing the MLS. And I'm convinced he got moved sideways because the commercials put so much pressure on Blair and his government to get rid of a potential danger, and Ben Bradshaw was a danger. But he was the last bloke we had in DEFRA who was going to make a difference. And I still rate, I wish we could have him back, because I think he's basically a very honest fella. Really, the rest of them have been time servers. They go into DEFRA, they follow policy, they do what the boss says, and they don't do much else besides. And I'm afraid the fisheries minister we've got now, I fear, is out of that same mould. What the next one will be like, we won't know. But we need to be in there fighting, and between the Trust and the EAA, we'll continue to fight. But I do say to you, whether you're a member of the Trust or not, I think probably my email address is fairly accessible. I always want to hear from anglers, because none of us have all the answers, and it's always useful when people turn and say, hang on a minute, have you thought of this? Because quite often, you're so involved in the woodwork, you can't actually see the tree. And it's really useful when anglers write to me and say, "Here, Mike, have you thought of doing so and so?" Yes, I might have done, but if I haven't, you can never have too many ideas in this business, and that means us all working together.